January 3rd, 1961, 9:01 p.m. The National Reactor Testing Station, Idaho, a specialist in the United States Army, walked into a small building in the desert and began a routine maintenance procedure that should have taken under 3 minutes. He reached for a single control rod. He was supposed to move it approximately 4 inches. He moved it 26. What happened next took less time than it takes to blink. The reactor went from 0 to 20,000 megawatts in milliseconds. The steam explosion that followed blew a 2,000-pound steel plate through the ceiling at high speed. When the first responders entered the building, 11 minutes later, they found one of the 3 men who had been inside pinned to the ceiling by the control rod itself. Pinned to the ceiling. The man's name was Richard Legg. He was 22 years old. This is the only nuclear accident in United States history to directly and immediately kill human beings. And the official cause listed in the final report is 2 words: undetermined cause. The SL-1 was not a large reactor. It was roughly the size of a water heater designed to power remote military installations in the Arctic. A compact, low-power research reactor that had been running in Idaho since 1958. The 3 men performing maintenance that night were not scientists. They were Army specialists, trained for the procedure, following a protocol they had executed dozens of times. The procedure called for reconnecting control rods after a scheduled shutdown. It was considered routine. The building had no public-facing presence. It processed no enriched fuel at industrial scale. It generated no power for civilian use. It was a test reactor in a desert, run by military personnel, with a dozen documented incidents in its operational history, none of them serious. Everything about the SL-1 was designed to be ordinary. Until 9:01 p.m. on January 3rd, 1961, it was. And then, in the time it takes to draw a breath, it was the most dangerous building in the United States. 3 things about this disaster that the official record has never satisfactorily explained. The first, the control rod was pulled 26 inches when the procedure called for 4. This is not a small error. This is not the kind of error that happens through inattention or miscalculation. Pulling a control rod 26 inches instead of 4 requires sustained physical effort over several seconds. The only person in the building with the strength and position to have pulled that rod was the man whose name appears in the accident investigation as the most likely primary actor. That man was John Burns, 22 years old. Burns had been having severe personal problems in the weeks before the accident. His marriage was in crisis. His wife had reportedly been involved with another person, a person whose name, according to investigators who spoke off the record in the years after the accident, was Richard Legg, the man who was found pinned to the ceiling. The second, the bodies of all 3 men were so radioactively contaminated that conventional burial was impossible. The hands and heads were surgically removed and buried separately as radioactive waste in lead-lined containers at a classified site in Idaho. This is documented in the official United States Atomic Energy Commission report. The men's families were told their loved ones were buried. They were not told what that burial looked like. The third, the first responders who entered the building were authorized to remain inside for exactly 65 seconds each before reaching their maximum permissible radiation dose for the day. 65 seconds. Richard Legg's body remained pinned to the ceiling for approximately 12 hours before a remotely operated device could be constructed and used to recover it. No one could reach him. No one could help him. The man who designed and operated that remote recovery device has never been publicly identified by name. The SL-1, Stationary Low-Power Reactor No. 1, came into operation in August 1958 at the National Reactor Testing Station in the Arco Desert of southeastern Idaho. The facility was part of a broader effort by the United States military to develop small, portable nuclear reactors that could power remote installations, radar stations in Alaska, bases above the Arctic Circle, forward operating positions where conventional fuel supply lines could not reach. The concept was sound, a compact reactor that could operate for months without refueling, requiring only a small technical crew, generating sufficient power for a remote base without the logistical chain of diesel fuel. The SL-1 was one of several designs being tested in Idaho in the late 1950s to determine which concepts were viable and which were not. The reactor itself was unremarkable by the standards of the time. A cylindrical core, approximately 1.4 meters tall, filled with aluminum-clad uranium fuel elements, moderated and cooled by ordinary water. 5 control rods regulated the reaction. When the rods were fully inserted, the reactor was subcritical. The chain reaction stopped. As the rods were withdrawn, the reaction increased. Basic nuclear physics. Contained in a stainless steel vessel, roughly the size of a commercial water heater, inside a small, single-story concrete building in the middle of the Idaho desert. The crew that operated the SL-1 in January 1961 were Army specialists, enlisted men who had received nuclear power training at various military facilities and been assigned to the test site. The work was not glamorous. The SL-1 was a research reactor, not a power station. The daily routine involved monitoring, record-keeping, maintenance cycles, and periodic shutdowns for inspection. The men who worked there were not nuclear engineers. They were young soldiers doing a technical job. On December 26, 1960, the SL-1 was shut down for scheduled maintenance over the holiday period. During the shutdown, the control rods were disconnected from their drives to allow inspection. When the reactor was ready to be brought back online, the rods had to be manually reconnected, a standard procedure that required each rod to be lifted slightly, aligned with the drive mechanism above it, and locked into place. On the evening of January 3, 1961, 3 men began that reconnection procedure. John Burns, 22 years old, was the senior specialist. Richard McKinley, 27, was his assistant. Richard Legg, 22, was also present. The procedure typically took under 10 minutes. At 9:01 p.m., something went wrong with the central control rod, designated CR9, the main regulator of the reactor's power output. The central control rod should have been lifted approximately 4 inches to reconnect to its drive mechanism. What the physical evidence, the reactor damage analysis, and the reconstruction by investigators indicated instead was that the rod was withdrawn approximately 26 inches in a single rapid motion. This took the reactor, in a fraction of a second, from subcritical, essentially inert, to supercritical at an extreme level. The energy release was equivalent to approximately 1.3 kilotons of TNT, almost entirely in the form of steam. The water surrounding the reactor core flashed to steam faster than the vessel could contain it. The reactor shield plug, a steel assembly weighing approximately 2,000 pounds, designed to sit on top of the reactor vessel, was blown upward at a velocity that has been estimated at over 100 feet per second. It hit the ceiling of the containment building. The ceiling stopped it. The rod that had been used to trigger the event was traveling at a similar velocity when it left the reactor. Richard Legg was directly above the reactor vessel at the moment of the explosion. When the first responders, health physics technicians from the testing station, entered the building 11 minutes after the explosion, they found John Burns alive, thrown approximately 9 feet across the floor, severely injured. Richard McKinley was alive, thrown against a wall, severely injured. Richard Legg was not on the floor. He was on the ceiling. The control rod, a steel cylinder approximately 2 inches in diameter and roughly 4 feet long, had passed through his body and embedded in the concrete ceiling 9 feet above the floor. He had been driven upward by the force of the explosion and pinned there by the rod that had been the instrument of his death. The first responders took in what they were seeing and were then told they had to leave. 65 seconds. That was all the time they were allowed before their dosimeters would register the maximum permissible daily dose. McKinley died approximately 2 hours after the explosion. Burns died several hours later. Neither regained full consciousness. Legg was pronounced dead at the scene. The recovery of his body from the ceiling required the construction of a remote-operated device, a kind of remotely controlled grapple, built over the following hours by engineers working from outside the building. The men who built it received radiation doses. The man who ultimately operated it received a significant dose. His name does not appear in the public record. The recovery took approximately 12 hours. What was recovered was placed in a lead-lined container and transported to a designated burial site in Idaho. The hands, which were too contaminated for conventional burial, were removed. So was the head. Both were interred separately as nuclear waste at a classified location. The investigation that followed was one of the most technically rigorous and politically sensitive accident investigations the Atomic Energy Commission had ever conducted. The technical conclusion that CR9 had been manually withdrawn 26 inches in a single rapid motion, causing a supercritical excursion, was not in serious dispute. The physical evidence was unambiguous. The question that the investigation never officially resolved was simpler and far more uncomfortable. Who did it and why? The three men in the building at the moment of the explosion were Burns, McKinley, and Legg. McKinley's position during the procedure made it physically unlikely that he was directly manipulating the central control rod. Legg's position directly above the reactor suggested he had not been the one manipulating it. The reconstruction of positions, combined with the injury patterns and the physical evidence, pointed toward Burns as the person who had been handling CR9 at the moment it was withdrawn. What the investigation could not determine, and what the official report explicitly declined to adjudicate, was whether the withdrawal was accidental, the result of the rod being improperly seated, sticking, and then releasing suddenly when force was applied, or deliberate. Investigators interviewed everyone who had known Burns, McKinley, and Legg in the weeks before the accident. Several interviews touched on the subject of Burns's personal circumstances. His marriage had been deteriorating severely. There were accounts of arguments. There were suggestions passed between investigators in off-the-record conversations that became part of the institutional memory of the event over the following decades, that Burns had reason to feel profound personal grievance toward at least one of the two men who were in the building with him that night. The AEC's final report on the SL-1 accident, released in 1962, listed the cause as undetermined. The possibility of intentional withdrawal of the control rod was noted and then set aside as unprovable. In the technical literature about nuclear reactor safety, the SL-1 accident is discussed almost exclusively in terms of its implications for control rod design, reactor safety systems, and the physical dynamics of prompt criticality excursions. The human circumstances, the marriage, the personal history, the question of intent, are treated as beyond the scope of engineering analysis, which is technically correct, and which has meant that for the last 60 years, one of the most important questions raised by the only fatal nuclear accident in American history has been officially designated as not worth answering. The SL-1 reactor was never rebuilt. The site was decontaminated over a period of years following the accident. The contaminated portions of the building were buried in situ. The Idaho desert closed over them. There is a marker at the site. It is not on most tourist maps. The accident led to significant changes in control rod design and operating procedures across the United States nuclear program. The specific failure mode that allowed a single person to cause a prompt criticality excursion was addressed in subsequent reactor designs. Safety systems were added. Procedures were redesigned to require multiple people to execute any operation that could affect reactivity. The SL-1 is cited in virtually every serious discussion of nuclear reactor safety history. The men who died there are cited less often. Burns, McKinley, and Legg were 22, 27, and 22 years old. They were soldiers doing a maintenance job in a desert in January. The three of them were buried in Idaho in lead-lined containers at a site maintained by the Department of Energy in graves that the families were not told the full contents of. The official cause of death for all three men is listed as radiation exposure. The official cause of the accident is listed as undetermined. Both of those statements are technically accurate. Neither of them tells you very much. The atomic testing station at Arco, Idaho, was one of the most unusual places in mid-century America. Officially, it was a barren stretch of high desert, sagebrush, volcanic rock, the occasional antelope. Unofficially, it was one of the most concentrated collections of experimental nuclear reactors in the world. By the early 1960s, there were over 50 separate reactor experiments at various stages of construction or operation across the site. Military reactors, civilian prototype reactors, research reactors of every conceivable configuration. The site was a laboratory for the entire American nuclear program, a place where ideas could be tested at full scale before being deployed. The men who worked there were a mixed group. Senior scientists and engineers from national laboratories lived in a compound near the test area. Military personnel like Burns, McKinley, and Legg were assigned to specific reactors for specific technical duties, rotating through shift work in the Idaho desert. It was not glamorous. The Idaho desert in January is bitterly cold, swept by wind, with very little to do in the evenings beyond drive to the nearest town. The social dynamics at the SL-1 in the months before January 1961 were, by the accounts of investigators who interviewed colleagues of the three men, unusually tense. Burns was described as a skilled and well-regarded technician, competent, confident, sometimes aggressive in personality. His marriage had been in difficulty for at least a year. Several colleagues described him as increasingly withdrawn and irritable in the weeks before the accident. The precise nature of his personal circumstances was established through interviews with his wife, with colleagues, and through the limited personal correspondence that investigators were able to access. The relationship between Burns and Legg, whether it was genuinely adversarial, whether Burns had specific knowledge that his wife and Legg had been involved, whether any direct confrontation had occurred between them in the days before January 3, was never conclusively established. Investigators noted the circumstantial elements and then in the formal report stepped back from them. The report noted the personal circumstances as background context and explicitly declined to use them as the basis for any conclusion about intent. This was, from the perspective of the official record, the appropriate stance. The evidence for intentionality was circumstantial. There was no confession, no witness to the act, no physical evidence that could prove beyond doubt that the withdrawal of CR9 was deliberate rather than accidental. In a legal and administrative sense, the undetermined conclusion was defensible. In the subsequent decades, the SL-1 accident became a fixture in nuclear safety training programs, not as a story about possible intentional sabotage, but as a cautionary case study in single-point failure and human factors in reactor operations. The primary lesson drawn was engineering no reactor design should allow a single individual acting alone to withdraw a control rod far enough to cause a prompt criticality excursion. This lesson was acted upon. Control rod designs were modified. Operational procedures were redesigned to require multiple operators for any reactivity affecting operation. The technical lessons of the SL-1 were absorbed and implemented across the entire American nuclear program. The human question, the one that sits underneath the engineering analysis and does not resolve into a lesson plan, received less systematic attention. The question of whether a personal grievance carried into a reactor room late on a January night in Idaho could explain what happened there has never been officially answered. The official record says undetermined. The unofficial record, as preserved in the institutional memory of the testing station and in the accounts of investigators who were there and spoke off the record to researchers in subsequent decades, says something more specific. But that version has never been placed in a formal document that can be cited by name. The SL-1 site was eventually decontaminated and the reactor materials buried in place. A portion of the testing station land was later transferred to the Department of Energy for the management of nuclear waste. The desert around the site is still classified as a radiological hazard area in certain zones. The sagebrush grows back. The 3 men who died there are not famous. Their names do not appear in the general public's knowledge of nuclear history, which tends to organize itself around the large civilian disasters. The SL-1 accident is a footnote in most histories of nuclear power, mentioned for its technical significance, and then moved past. The question at its center, was this an accident or was it something else, has been open for 64 years and will almost certainly remain so. The SL-1 accident occupies a specific place in the architecture of nuclear safety regulation that is worth understanding. Every major nuclear accident, 3 Mile Island in 1979, Chernobyl in 1986, Fukushima in 2011, is studied in the context of what was learned from the accidents that preceded it. The SL-1 is one of the foundation stones of that learning. The principle that no single human action should be able to take a reactor to prompt criticality is implemented in every civilian and military reactor design built after 1961. The SL-1 is why that principle exists. The price of that lesson was 3 20-something soldiers in an Idaho desert, and a question that will never have an official answer. If you want to understand the stories behind the official reports, the questions that were asked and then officially set aside, the names that never made the history books, and the accidents that changed the world without ever making the front page, subscribe. Every week, a story that was hidden in plain sight.